All right, so this week we'll cover another 10 chapters or so. On the screen, you can see chapters 12 through 22, and that'll put us just shy of about halfway through Genesis. But for all intent and purpose, we pretty much are there. We'll only have about 2 more weeks to spend on this book before we roll on over into Exodus. So tonight, I cut it off here at 22 verses rolling through 25, only because I wanted to just basically cap it off, beginning and end, bookend style, with the story arc of Abraham. So before we get started, any questions that you guys were pondering from what we covered last week? Good news is that whereas last week I had 33 slides, tonight there's only 10, so less than a third. So that gives us a lot more time to slow down and just kind of breathe and take our time as we're strolling through this story. And of course, our approach is not necessarily going chapter by chapter, but hitting the most significant parts of this story, because we're taking into consideration here the narrative design that Moses has, as he's been guided by the Spirit, intentionally put in place for us. And a lot of what we're going to discover tonight is actually setting us up for where he comes in on the scene, and the part of his story begins as we roll over from Genesis to Exodus and then finish out the Torah. As you can imagine, with nearly 50 years worth of life from the time that Abram was called until he dies, there's so much that could be told, and yet we're only given about 10 chapters worth of space dedicated to the most significant portions of the story. And we should always remember, anytime that we're reading Scripture, the story, or the authors of the story, the compilers of the information and whatnot, do not have to tell us anything. Everything that they do give us detail-wise is significant, and it is important for us to try to sift through the information to get a better feel for what is the overall story here before we start drilling down into the weeds at personal applications and so forth. So anyway, as we jump into this, I just want to help us first off appreciate something of this design pattern that I'm talking about, and that is what is called a chiasm. And these things, can be seen all throughout Scripture in just a handful of verses. Usually you'll see that kind of arrangement perhaps in a part of a psalm. But certainly you can even see this at a more macro level with respect to books and their entire arrangement and so forth. But this, as goes the story arc of Abraham, pretty much is laid out in a chiastic fashion. So when we talk about a chiasm, what we're looking at is the top line or point is mirrored by the next line or point, which is usually either complementary or completely antithetical to that. And so what you'll normally see then is a repetition then of the information. Case in point, when you look at A on the top and then A with that little stick off to the side, which is actually what we call prime, so A prime, you can see that this is the beginning and the end, or the climactic moment, of Abraham's spiritual Odyssey. Odyssey is just a fancy word for journey. So think that when you're reading that word. But of course, when we start this, it's Abram, and when we end it, it's Abraham. And as you work your way through that, the central point of that, or I should say the center point of that, is the first couple of verses that we read that begins the narrative portion of what is Genesis 17, when Abram becomes Abraham. But on top and bottom, you can see the way that Moses has stylized this story is almost an exact repetition of the same things, albeit perhaps slightly different characters, certainly different circumstances if they are the same characters. A good point would be in C, when Abram comes to the rescue, and in this case it's of Sodom and of Lot. Obviously, it's not the same predicament in which he comes to the rescue again now as Abraham, later on in Genesis 17 through 19 really, but right in the heart of that is Genesis 18, because there Sodom is going to be destroyed. But up top with C and Abram coming to rescue there, it's when the battle of the 5 kings begins with, or goes out to fight against the battle of the 4 kings and those coalition armies that are fighting against each other as a big power grab for who's going to control the Levant, or the area that we would call Canaan and so forth. And when that battle ensues, Sodom and the city of the plains winds up getting caught up in that conflagration, and sadly, Lot gets taken away. And of course, we've got that skirmish one. Abram goes off to do battle with a small little army, and he winds up bringing back all the spoils of war. But nonetheless, a totally different circumstance, but yet still the people of Sodom are caught up in this, and Lot is perhaps not the only one rescued. He's the only one given to us by name, and it's obvious the reasons why that would be. So just helping us, number one, understand a little bit of the way a chiasm works. Number two, we're going to use this tonight as kind of our guiding rubric as we're laying out Abram's story arc and appreciating the flip sides of this covenant moment in Genesis 17. And when we speak of this covenant, a couple of things that we should remember from last week is that we're working off the presumptive notion that I think is pretty well solidified and backed up biblically in many places, and that is we're not looking at various distinct covenants. We're dealing with one particular covenant, right, that God has laid upon Adam to start with, and he has continued to push that covenant forward onto the shoulders of others that he is working with as human partners to bring about what is the ideal agenda pictured in the words that he spoke to Adam first, which is rule, subdue, and then thinking of the garden context from Genesis 2, to guard or keep, and of course to work that garden, right? So a coronation as king, a commission as priest, and the idea, of course, expanding out the barrier of that garden until eventually it winds up encompassing the entire world as more and more image bearers come to walk in the wisdom and light of God's counsel per Adam's priestly involvement in that, right? And then continuing to add more order and complexity to the beautiful creation that God had placed the man in, and of course to rule over. That is the backbone and the central structure of every single covenant diagram that we might look at with respect to what God does and says to Noah. We saw last week, using the same words verbatim to start off that covenant with in Genesis 9. And then we see a recycling of those terms. They're repackaged, they're maybe completely stylized in different ways, but the central elements of those covenant promises and mandates are still there. Now granted, as those covenants are expanded and stipulations might be added for different reasons, it perhaps serves a slightly different purpose for the meantime, but the idea is still the same. And the idea is the ideal, and that is God's sacred space of Eden being taken out to encompass the world, and everybody, after the events of Genesis 3, and then eventually Genesis 11 with the dispersion at Babel, coming back in to God's covenant family as God works to reach out and reconcile all humanity to himself. I accidentally kicked my power cord out. I'm going to get down here and put this back in before my computer winds up shutting off on me. That would just be terrible. All right, so let's actually open our Bibles. We're going to read a couple of sections tonight. And the first one's going to be from Genesis 12. And we're going to read the first 9 verses. So the Lord said to Abram, "Go from your land, your relatives, and your father's house to the land that I will show you, and I will make you into a great nation. I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you. I will curse anyone who treats you with contempt, and all the peoples on earth will be blessed through you." So Abram went as the Lord had told him, and Lot with him. Abram was 75 years old when he left Haran. He took his wife Sarai, his nephew Lot, all the possessions they had accumulated, and the people they had acquired in Haran, and they set out for the land of Canaan. When they came to the land of Canaan, Abram passed through the land to the site of Shechem, at the oak of Moreh. And at that time the Canaanites were in the land. The Lord appeared to Abram and said, "To your offspring I will give this land." So he built an altar there to the Lord who had appeared to him. And from there he moved on to the hill country east of Bethel and pitched his tent in Bethel, with Bethel on the west and Ai on the east. And he built an altar to the Lord there. He called on the name of the Lord. Then Abram journeyed by stages to the Negev. So if we remember something of the structure of what we looked at last week, considering the idea that, as I had just reiterated, God has made the man a king, terrible crown, why I stopped short there, king and I don't know really what to draw for priest, so I'm just going to write that word there. King and priest with respect to the covenant that he's made with Adam. Again, Genesis 1 terminology of subduing and ruling, as God has made man in his image, and everything has been subjected under him. And then, of course, in Genesis 2:15, to work and to guard, watch, or keep, whatever your translation may say, those being those priestly words from Numbers 3 and 18 of Avad and Shamar. We understood from what we were talking about last week, that context forces us to go back and reconsider what God was commissioning Adam to do in the garden. We bring that forward over to Noah and now to Abram as God is speaking to him in Genesis 12. And in the first 3 verses, we see a recapping of God basically passing on this mandate to rule by saying, I'm going to make a great nation out of you, but that nation is not going to be static. Obviously, it's going to grow, but when it does grow, it's growing with one teleological purpose in mind. One teleological purpose in mind. That comes from the root word or prefix telos, which means an endpoint. There is an idea or an agenda that's being strived for here, and that comes with verse 3, that all families of the world be blessed. So that influence in and of itself is going to reach back to the concept here of what God has commissioned Adam to do in his coronation as king, and that is to rule and subdue. Subdue is not to, in some oppressive manner, take what you can by virtue of your dominance and power and make it yours because no one can stand up to you and challenge you. The idea of subduing is what God had been doing through the events of Genesis 1, adding order and complexity to what was nothing more than primordial chaos. He is inviting humanity to step into this role as king and priest to do the same alongside him. So the idea here is that Abraham and his family ultimately are going to be reaching far forward into the future and somehow doing this. It's completely enigmatic, totally mysterious at this point as to how exactly they're going to accomplish this, but that is exactly what God is hoping and wanting them to strive for, okay? But then notice the response here. Just like when Noah gets off the ark, what's the first thing he winds up doing as the animals are coming off with him? Builds an altar. Now, of course, part of that, as most of us are kind of influenced growing up to think, is perhaps an extension of him being thankful for the fact he's been delivered through the world-ending conflagration of the flood. But that's not Moses' point in including that in the story. The idea is what's going on in Genesis 2 when God brings the man into the sacred space of this prototypical garden temple. It's priestly function. Here with Noah, it's the same thing, priestly function. And now that God has spoken to him, called him, and then Abram finishes this journey that takes years to do, but he finally gets into the new sacred space. Understand that. We have to back up and go to where we left off last week. So if we think about the rivers of the Euphrates and the Tigris, and this being the place perhaps where the Garden of Eden geographically was, and then of course the ark came to rest up here in the mountains of Ararat and whatnot, and then they start their migration down toward the plain of Shinar, which is ancient Mesopotamia, the very spot where civilization will wind up having its roots, its most ancient beginnings. And of course, the geographic location of where the garden was, they seem to be reaching back to the ideal so that they can exact what they choose to do in Genesis 11, build this city tower complex and uniting heaven and earth together and trying to find a way to appease God, but yet manipulate God to give them what they want while they can get what they want from God. And of course, God answers this in judgment. But this is the very space from which Abram is called from ground zero of this exilic expulsion away from what once was God's sacred space. God calls a man, and he wants him to go away from there, due west. Remember, we talked about this as we concluded our lesson last week. East, as it's attached as a cardinal direction, and just about any story that it's given to us as a detail, is almost always met with negative connotations. It's the idea of people being pushed away from God's presence. Because the garden had its entrance facing the east. The tabernacle, anytime it gets put back together, and is situated properly. Its entrance is always facing the east, and the temple, when it's built on Jerusalem's summit, its entrance is facing the east. So that's being invited into God's presence. Going away from that, of course, is being pushed away or leaving God's presence. So to be called in this westerly direction, you can imagine, is somewhat being invited into God's presence. We're not there yet. We don't have that level of complexity and detail in the story, but we're starting to see that being laid down for us if God is calling Abram away from this. He wants him to come here, and when he wants to put him in Canaan, the idea is that Eden is going to be recycled and begun anew in this place. And when he finally gets there, what does he start doing but building altars? And when he starts building altars all over the place, obviously, while there are already sacred shrines and holy sites on tops of hills and mountains, under trees and whatnot, as the Canaanites already have an established religion, and they're worshiping a pantheon of gods, yet he is doing exactly what this priestly function is supposed to be requiring of him, and that is establishing the presence and name of Yahweh in this new land that's going to be consecrated ultimately to him generations off in the future. All right, so let's begin looking a little more broadly at the story arc of Abram. So far, any questions? No? Okay. Well, one thing I hope that we can appreciate from this is, as you can see on the right side of the screen, that those events in the book of Exodus have nothing to do with the story that we're looking at tonight. But what is going on at this particular portion of the beginning of Abraham's story arc will heavily prefigure what's eventually going to happen later on with the story of the people that will come from him. I want you to all to become familiar with a term that I will use a lot, and that is microcosm. So in essence, what a microcosm is basically is a small scale version of something that is a representation of a much larger reality in and of itself, right? And so there are all manner of metaphorical examples of this in our own, day-to-day society. We talk about rat race, right? And the idea of putting rats in a mazes and see who can figure their way to the end with whatever the bait is you're using at the other end. And we use that to refer, perhaps, to the way that we live our lives, scurrying about back and forth, getting up every day, showering, going to work, doing everything we do there, coming home, managing our lives as families and whatnot, going to bed, and tomorrow we'll wake up and do the whole thing all over again. But that is a global understanding of how we all run through our own rat race, considering a much more scaled down version, which could easily fit on the size of this table that my laptop's on, right? So Abraham's story is in many ways a microcosm of what's going to transpire while his story takes place over decades. We're talking centuries, even a millennium with respect to Israel itself. And in some ways, we see this story almost kind of unfolding itself and repeating itself in a cyclical fashion. It will continue on and on and on again. A way of representing this might be that if you look at the first 11 chapters of Genesis, you can see a very quick spiraling out of control from God creating all things, and he continuously repeats, it's good, good, good. And by the time you get to Genesis 11 with respect to the idea of the expulsion of all humanity and all nations away from God's presence at Babel, it's a pretty quick sequence. But then when you get from 12 all the way to the end of 2 Chronicles, basically, we have the same thing again. But it's a much more exaggerated spiraling out of control as God expresses quite a bit more mercy. And there are reasons behind that. Don't have time to go into them. But nonetheless, if we get that sequence down, then we understand how that impacts the rest of the story moving forward as we see this kind of thing repeated over and over again. And sometimes the space in between these things is so spread out, we might miss the subtlety of the details. But if we can sharpen our eyes and catch them, we'll appreciate it a little better. So why is God doing this? Why is God giving us this representation in this microcosm here in Abraham's life of what's going to ultimately happen with respect to his people in Egypt and their deliverance through the Exodus and eventually them moving on into the land of Canaan? Why doesn't God just simply establish Abraham here? Why doesn't he put him there, flourish him, make him a great nation there by giving him a multitude of descendants? I mean, after all, when you get to the stories of the judges, Gideon, one man, is accredited as having 70 sons. Why didn't God multiply Abraham's seed like that? Why didn't he make exceptions for him and allow him to have multiple wives and concubines so that he can multiply his seed as much as possible so that within a few generations, like you see going on in Egypt, when Abraham's family moves from Canaan down into Egypt at the end of the entire Genesis story, why go through all of that struggle just to get them back in the land of Canaan? There has to be purpose. There has to be intent behind that. And if we're not reflecting on that, then we're missing something, all right? So that's the purpose of grasping this now, is so that we can understand what God intends on doing later on with the nation that is going to eventually come from Abraham, okay? And of course, for them to be able to look back on this and see that God had been working this out all along, and ultimately, perhaps the greater teleological principle, again, teleological principle, is these stories are situated in such a way that they continue to build momentum and point us forward to the ultimate answer. It's as if every one of them ends on something of a cliffhanger with making us want more as to, well, what's the answer to the problem? Why are they still doing this? How have they not learned yet? Or, well, I thought they were going to do it. He seemed like he was the one, and yet we are wanting, after that person falls miserably flat on their face, as we've already seen some examples of Adam, and then Noah, and then, as we will with Abram, as he falters at multiple points along the spectrum, why do they continue to do these things? And why is God so merciful in using broken human beings as he is? Anyway, so let's read some scripture, and then we'll look at these points right here. So back to the chapter we were at, we're going to read the rest of it here, 10 through 20. There was a famine in the land, this is Canaan, so Abram went down to Egypt to stay there for a while because the famine in the land was severe. And when he was about to enter Egypt, he said to his wife Sarai, "Look, I know what a beautiful woman you are. When the Egyptians see you, they will say, 'This is his wife.' They will kill me, but let you live. Please say you're my sister, so it will go well with me because of you, and my life will be spared on your account." When Abram entered Egypt, the Egyptians saw that the woman was very beautiful. Pharaoh's officials saw her and praised her to Pharaoh. So the woman was taken to Pharaoh's household. He treated Abram well because of her, and Abram acquired flocks and herds, male and female donkeys, male and female slaves, and camels. But the Lord struck Pharaoh and his household with severe plagues because of Abram's wife Sarai. So Pharaoh sent for Abram and said, "What have you done to me? Why didn't you tell me she was your wife? Why did you say she's my sister, so that I took her as my wife? Now here is your wife. Take her and go." Then Pharaoh gave his men orders about him, and they sent him away with his wife and all that he had. So, first thing, Abram is in the land of Canaan. He has worked systematically after crossing the top of the Euphrates to come from the north end down to the south end. And we should understand the south end is mostly desert. I draw the triangle because it kind of tapers off as the Mediterranean dips in this way. And of course, we've got the Gulf of Aqaba from the Red Sea coming up in this direction, and this peels off down into the direction of Egypt. Now, some things we need to recognize with respect to the text. Abraham, forgive me, I'm going to probably keep doing that. Abram recognizes there's a crisis, famine in the land. One thing that we do not find in the text is no compulsion by the Holy Spirit to go to Egypt. We know nothing here of the Lord attempting to try to influence Abram's thinking and to understanding. It's probably not good for you to be here right now, so go ahead and go on down to Egypt, because Egypt, it had the reputation, even up into the time of the Roman period, with Mark Antony and Octavian, who eventually becomes Caesar Augustus, as being the grain bed of the ancient world. And of course, as long as the Nile continued in its cycles of sustenance with repeatedly, repetitiously flooding the area and bringing that rich silt in so that they could replant and harvest the spelt, the barley, the wheat, and everything that they could grow down there, they could literally feed just about every square inch of the known world around them at that point in time. But we don't have God saying that to him. We do see God saying that to Abraham's descendants when the story finally reaches Jacob that Joseph actually is alive. He rules over the land of Egypt. Pharaoh has sent wagons up here and told we all can come down there. And God does speak to Jacob and say, it's okay for you to go. But before we get there, we've got Isaac. And when the same thing happens with respect to Isaac, and there's a famine in the land, like there was in the time of Abram. So it must have been pretty bad, as Moses is telling us. It seems that Isaac's journey is heading in that direction as he leaves Hebron and is going southwest or west by southwest toward Gerar, which is in the direction of Egypt, and God tells him, do not go to Egypt. So if God interjected and stopped Isaac, I would think it's possible we can infer from that God maybe did not want what happened here to actually wind up happening. It's hard to say because we have to argue from silence, but nonetheless, Abram winds up going down into Egypt, and he does so because of famine. Now, it's setting us up for what is eventually going to wind up happening with respect to the migration of Egypt at the end of the book of Genesis that leads us into the actual Exodus pattern that is the book of Exodus itself. At the time Abram goes down there, before he even gets there, he senses there could be a threat to the promise. At the beginning of this chapter, God says, I'm going to make a great nation out of you. How is that possible if Abram has no children? He's got to have kids, right? Who is he married to? Not 10 wives, not even 2 wives, but one, Sarai. It's going to have to be through her that this propagation of seed is going to wind up becoming a living, breathing reality. But he knows, as is the way the world works at this moment, that it's probable that Sarai, even at this advanced age, is still beautiful enough that Pharaoh will want to take her and make her his own. What should Abram have done in this moment? What has Abram already at this moment failed to do? If Abram is in the promised land that God has told him that you will own every square inch of this land, every place where the sole of your foot touches, Abram sees that there's famine. Maybe the famine encompasses the whole land, but we're not told that in Scripture. Abram could have potentially turned around and went the opposite direction and went back northward to find a place where there was food and sustenance. But Abram does not stop and infer or inquire from the Lord, what should he do? And better yet, now that he's going down to Egypt, he's employing what we can all esteem to be conventional wisdom. I'm married to a beautiful woman. The man who rules over Egypt is a powerful king who can virtually do whatever he wants, especially to people who enter in his land and are not citizens or subject of his. And by virtue of that, nobody's going to do anything if this guy winds up trying to take what isn't his. Who am I and what am I to stand in his way? He can marshal his forces against me. He could snuff out my existence like that. And there's nothing I can do to prevent that. Problem is that Pharaoh is not on par with God. He's not equaling to God in his authority. And certainly if God has made the promise to Abram, if Abram was acting in faith, the understanding would be, even though I'm going to Egypt and hope there to find grain and can stay there long enough until this famine winds up resolving itself and then come back to the land, I can live there, though every eye around me may be taken aback by the beauty of the woman I'm married to, yet there is no existential threat as to whether or not they're going to take her away from me because God is going to ensure that she remains attached to me. But that's not what happens. There's a threat against the covenant, a threat to kill the man and potentially keep the woman, although Pharaoh never speaks such words, but it does become the reality of the situation that you'll see with respect to his descendants in Egypt. But it's important for us to appreciate that parallel. Or then again, the plagues in Egypt. Now this is where the story starts to get a little squirrely, because it seems like at this point, if we're following this logically, Abram is the one who's made mistakes. Pharaoh, while not innocent by no means, and he should not be amassing wives for himself, that's repeating the mistake of Genesis 6. Sons of God, daughters of men, really beautiful, take as many as they want for wives. And of course, because of that, a proliferation of sin at an exponential rate and at such a level that God chooses to destroy all creation. And we're seeing something of a repetition of this kind of thing with Pharaoh in Egypt, right? If he can take more wives than just the one that he calls his queen and make harems like all these other ancient kings are doing, that does not hold him in this position of innocence. But at the same time, if Abram's the one who's been making the mistakes all along in this story so far, why is it that the Lord reaches out and strikes Egypt with plagues? Why is it that he strikes out against Pharaoh's household with plagues? If we're being honest, I think in a real way, that's almost a nonsensical thing, the way that we rationalize the story. This is why it's so important for us to start establishing the understanding that this is setting us up as a microcosm for what God is ultimately going to do with respect to delivering Abraham's descendants out of the land of Egypt. We are seeing here a picturesque foreshadowing of God's visitation and judgment upon Egypt to deliver Abraham's descendants out of that place. Follow the rest of the story. Abram, as part of the exchange or acquiring of a bride price, a dowry for his sister, winds up receiving this massive amount of wealth of donkeys, slaves, both male and female, camels, all manner of things. But once this conflagration of plagues is over with and Pharaoh realizes, however he becomes aware of the fact that what's happened here is Abram's fault, that this woman is not really his sister but his wife, and that the remedy to the problem is to give her back. Pharaoh doesn't come to Abraham and say, but wait a minute here. I gave you all of this. Every single bit of this you did not have until you came down here, and I gave you that for a wife. And guess what I don't have? I don't have a wife, so give me that back. He doesn't demand any of it back. Not a coin, not a donkey, not a man or a woman. He gets to keep it all. What happens when the people of Israel wind up actually leaving Egypt? Before they are even told by Moses that he has come to deliver them out of there, Moses is being told that God is going to spoil Egypt and they are going to leave there wealthier than they were when they came down there. And obviously so, because it was only a group of about 70 that went down there. However much wealth they had acquired at that point is going to be multiplied when you consider the hundreds of thousands of people that are going to be able to go to their neighbors around them who are literally throwing their earrings and their armbands and bracelets and necklaces, and even giving them clothes and fabric to make more clothes with, demanding, get out of our land before your God kills us on the night of the 10th and final plague, right? So it's setting us up for the anticipation of the repeat of this cycle once we actually get to the Exodus story. And if we're being honest, this kind of thing has actually happened many, many times already up until this point, and it's going to happen many, many more times after that. Exodus cycles are something that we see embedded all through Genesis, and if you notice here, from Abram from Ur and all the way over to Abram from Gerar is at least 5 different Exodus-type movements in the story arc of Abram himself, and considering his son and his grandson after him, which pretty much encompasses the rest of Genesis. Again, multiple repetitions of this cycle. So when we get to the book that bears the actual name, Exodus, we should not be surprised to see that when there's an existential threat to the purpose of God and the people of God, and it requires something of God manipulating circumstances to get them out of that circumstance, that process in and of itself is considered an exodus. Even though when we say exodus, we're thinking children of Israel, Egypt, coming out of there, going to the promised land of Canaan. That's exodus. That's true, but that's just one of many. One of many. All right, moving on with Abram's life. The goal remains constant. By virtue of that, what I mean is part of what we've already reiterated, the idea that God, in the first opening chapters of Genesis, has already established the ideal of a space and a commission, a garden and a man he coronates as king, commissions as priest. He moves that forward after the flood is over with the new man, the new image bearer, the new Adam, if you will, who comes out of the ark, and we see him honoring that by building altars, sacrificing upon it, and then moving that forward now with respect to Abram. As God has called Abram, the understanding is moving to a new place, and by virtue of that, eventually this is going to become the sacred space that Eden was. Hence the reason why when we get to the beginning of the book of Exodus, it's described as a land flowing with milk and honey. Literally, that's not to be understood as something where there are waterfalls of milk and pools of honey all over the place. It's just the idea of abundance in Eden being re-imaged in the abundance that God is going to provide in Canaan. He speaks of cities they will not build being handed over to them, vineyards that they did not plant that they will draw the abundance from. All those things, right? That's about as garden-esque and as paradisal as you can possibly get with respect to imagery. So It's just one more thing to help us understand that God has not shelved the ideal of God dwelling with humanity and God's glory filling the earth with what's going to come at the end of the entire Bible story in the book of the Apocalypse, or the vision that is the revelation of Jesus that John writes for us. This is something that is firmly embedded as a series of stepstones from one story to the next all throughout the Bible, and it's repeated so many times in the book of Genesis. All right, so a little bit more on the idea of Abram prefiguring Israel's struggle. So as we've talked about, Abram goes to Egypt. God rescues Sarai because within her womb, not yet, we have not got there, but the idea is that at some point, her womb is going to become the conduit through which the promised child, who is the actual embodiment of all that God has just said in the opening 3 verses of Genesis 12, is going to come through, right? And then God blesses Abram with wealth and he sends plagues on Pharaoh. Israel will experience the same cycle. Moving on. Abram in Genesis chapter 13 does something else that's kind of a little silly and boneheaded. Now, if you think about it, Genesis 12, with respect to what's going on at the top of the chapter in the first 3 verses, maybe the first 9, since we read that as a chunk, is almost like taking us back to Genesis chapters 1 and 2. All right, so Genesis 12, 1 through 9, kind of taking us back to Genesis chapters 1 and 2. The rest of the chapter, 10 and onward, is kind of taking us back over into the place of Genesis 3. What happens in Genesis 3? The fall. We got a serpent who enters in the scene, and this Nakash, or shining one, he beguiles the woman, and the man just stands there and lets this happen, and he joins in with her in her treacherous rebellion against the God who made them in his image and has commissioned them with this noble task of bearing his image, filling the world with his glory. We can expect the same thing if we're seeing this cycle repeated. It too will wind up factoring in, maybe at one or several points through this story. The first place we see that happening is hints of it, seeds of it being dropped with Abram's decision. What exactly was going on in the garden? They have the choice between 2 trees, 2 sources of wisdom, God's wisdom, and then, of course, we shouldn't call this man's wisdom because this is not bad wisdom, but it's wisdom that should only be attained when God makes it accessible. And he forbids it to begin with, but as we saw from examples provided last week, God is happy with the idea that others ask for such wisdom later on in Scripture. But it's getting it when God allows it and not outside of those parameters, which is the quintessential meaning of what the serpent was driving at when he said, you'll be like God. And you'll be able to understand and distinguish the difference between right and wrong and go on to establish that for yourselves, becoming your own God, not having to rely on him. Abram, in exercising what we might call conventional wisdom, is thinking along the same line. It makes good sense. There's no food here. Go where there's food, right? Your kids are hungry. You're driving in the car. Everybody's screaming and hollering. You as dad or mom driving are literally about to pull the last strands of your hair out until you can get some hamburgers in their gullet, and then they can stop begging you for food. So the idea, of course, is meet it with an easy answer because it's an easy enough problem as it is. But the one thing that's missing is discernment here. Was this the right move? Did they inquire of the Lord? Of course, that's missing. And we see the same thing almost happening again once they leave Egypt. As Genesis 3:15 gives us a promise of the squashing of the serpent or the head of the serpent by the seed that comes from the woman, and we're not seeing all hope is lost in that. Even though Abram's made a tragic mistake in going to Egypt and these events transpire as they do, thankfully God redeems. But as soon as he winds up leaving the land, what happens next? We're not going to read all of it, but just a few verses from chapter 13. So as they're coming out from Egypt in verses 8 through 9 of chapter 13, now we have got some issues going on within the camp between Abram and Lot. They have massive amounts of flocks and herds and so forth, and their servants apparently are not getting along with each other, haggling over resources and whatnot. So Abram, acting as the statesman that he is, says this in verse 8, "Please, let's not have quarreling between you and me, or between your herdsmen and my herdsmen, since we are relatives. Isn't the whole land before you? Separate from me. If you go to the left, I will go to the right. If you go to the right, I will go to the left." Let me try to make the board just a wee bit more legible so we can appreciate this just a wee bit better. But imagine, if you will, this is the land of Canaan, and this is Egypt, and here they are just on the southern border, and that being what will become the Dead Sea, the Jordan River, and the eventual Sea of Galilee. So they're not quite back in the land yet. And Abram is saying to Lot, if you will go left, then I'll go right. And if you go right, or if you go, the inverse of what I just said. I don't want to repeat what I just said, failing to realize, and it'll keep straight in my mind what it was I said a second ago. Here's the issue, though. Who did God promise this land to? Does this belong to Lot? In fact, we can even question something of the wisdom itself in bringing Lot. Who did God call to leave the land of their ancestors and come to a land he will show him? Was it Terah, Abram's father? Was it Lot, the son of Abram's deceased brother? It's understandable why they would want to reach out in this familial connection to each other, as is very common, not only customary, but even essential in an honor-shame society that is even still prevalent today, but of course has its beginning in these ancient Near Eastern cultures, for them to behave this way. And it's not to say that God was condemning at all of the idea of bringing Lot along, but Lot is not part of this covenant promise in the way Abram is. He can benefit from it, and that too is part of the tragedy of this, is that Abram is suggesting them separate versus let's find a way to compromise. And even if we have to thin out our flocks and herds and find somebody else to give these animals to, God has promised, and you know what it is that I'm going to get. And this, of course, can be yours too. Your people can easily share in this as well. But if it's going to be too much of a burden, then hey, something's got to give. But instead, let's separate. Back to the point though. What would have happened if Lot had said, okay, yeah, sure, I'll go left. I'll go take the land of Canaan. And Abram is now going to have to consign himself to living outside of the land. Is this where God wants him? Obviously not. And of course, as the story will escalate in a very short time period, Abram is already concerned with the idea, I'm old, I have no kids, I have no idea when I'm going to die, and so God, can you kind of make this promise happen a little faster, if you will? Hence the story of Hagar and Ishmael, which happens not too long after this. So if Abram's already concerned about these things, then if he puts himself in this predicament of now having consigned himself outside the land, if he dies, how is he ever going to pass this on to descendants when he never actually settled in the land to start with? Because again, he just journeyed through it, migrated down into Egypt, hasn't even come back and done so much as set his tent up and got to know his neighbors yet. Terrible, boneheaded choice. A lot of times I think when this gets packaged to us, though, when we're growing up in church and we're reading this story, hence the reason why I use the moniker, being the statesman that he is that somehow this is Abram who doesn't have to give the choice to the younger one, the younger member of his family, but he does, because that's speaking highly of Abram's character. That's not the detail that Moses wants us to get. Moses wants us to understand, as God then speaks to Abram and he says, I'm giving you the land. The land will belong to you and your descendants. Anyway, and then as we move on beyond this, Abram questions if he will even possess the land, and that kind of takes us into the contents of Genesis 15. I just want to give us a little blurb right here, though, that God mimics the Passover in the contents of that passage and the Exodus through a sacrificial ceremony and passing through in fire and smoke. We will talk about that a little bit from now. And then, of course, on into chapters 16 through 17, Abram has a son through Hagar, and by virtue of that, in Genesis 17, God will bring about a judgment through circumcision. This is part of that process where a lot of times I think we wind up missing some of the subtleties of the details that's given for us as clear clues contextually in the actual passage. But when God speaks of actually giving circumcision as a sign of the covenant, we might think of that's something to be celebrated. And in some ways, it is, because God is further affirming and solidifying this covenant with Abram, who now will take on the name of Abraham, which is a blessing, because Abraham means father of nations. But understand that every male who does not get circumcised will, like the foreskin that's removed from his body surgically, be cut off from the people, like his foreskin should have been. It's a play on words, But the idea is that if he is cut off from his people as if he is never even a part of them, was never born to them, is a sign of judgment, then the circumcision act in and of itself is a sign of judgment. And it's not ironic in any way, shape, or form, or I should say coincidental, that Genesis 16 is the whole story of Sarai giving Abram the joy and pleasure of having Hagar, a woman that was not his wife, to sexually gratify himself with and conceive a child that will be surrogate for her so that she can legally adopt that child and make him the heir to Abraham. And then as part of that, which was never part of God's plan, God answers that with judgment in the form of circumcision. Meaning the member of your body by which you procreate life with is mine. It belongs to me. And you will only make children when I allow that to be possible. You understand, I'm the one who gives children, not you, by finagling the circumstances and manipulating them so that you can have children by your own accord because that's what you want and that's what you think that you need. All right. So moving on, there's a couple of other connections between Abraham and Israel. I just want to make sure that we get this firmly embedded because, again, if we don't appreciate this in the Genesis narrative, then it will not have the impact it's meant to once we actually get to the next book in the Torah sequence. So back to Genesis 12, Abram's called from the exile of Babylon. We need to get that. What happened at Babel is an exile, and it's the biggest exile that we have in the entire story sequence of Scripture because this is the exile of all humanity away from God. You consider in Isaiah chapter 60 with the concept of a beam of light shining from the heavens above down on the tiny little city of Jerusalem, and all the rest of the nations pictured around Jerusalem are in total, utter darkness. Just like the land of Goshen, where the Israelites are in Egypt, and it's where they have been living since they moved down there under Jacob until they leave the place under Moses. During that period for 3 days, when total darkness that was so thick you could feel it in the land of Egypt, consumed Pharaoh's house, meaning all the land of Egypt, except for Goshen. The idea is that in this dispersion from Babel, it's not just a, hey, we all learn how to speak a new language today. Awesome. It's all the nations have been pushed away from God, and they are not allowed to be a part of God's covenant family moving forward until God does something to work on reversing that, which is the whole reason why he is called Abram in the first place. So Abram leaves Babylon because that's what Babel is, right? It's a wordplay with respect to the idea of the nation city-state that will become the kingdom and empire of Babylon in ancient antiquity at different points. You know, the Babylon that is built here and now in Genesis 11 is not the same Babylon of Daniel and Nebuchadnezzar's day, but I digress. Anyway, to pull away from ground zero of this dispersion and exile to a new place to reestablish a new Eden. In a very real way, when they were building the city tower complex in Babel, that's what they were striving for, rebuilding the remnants of Eden. Not establishing a garden, but a complex that's a nexus point to bring heaven and earth back together, which is exactly what Eden was. And God says, nope, I'm not having that. But then he turns right around and he calls a man and he says, I will make you great, and I will make a great nation come from you, and through you bless all the nations of the world by bringing him to a land that's going to become a new Eden. That's the whole thrust of the story arc behind God's initial call to Abram. But before chapter 12 ends, Abram goes to a self-imposed exile down in Egypt, a new Babylon. Because if you think about it, the Babel that becomes Babylon in Genesis 11 is a place where man's pride is yet at full sway in trying to get what he wants. Manipulate God to have what he will have on his own terms. And of course, that causes us to go back to Genesis 6 and think about sexual gratification and exploitation with sons of God, daughters of men, and all those kinds of things. Babylon becomes an archetype that all the enemies of God's people are going to be compared against over and again. So in Egypt, or the Egypt in Genesis 12, is a Babylon. It's a Pharaoh taking what he wants. Even though he pays money for it, still, it's the idea of, she's a beautiful woman, I will have her. A son of God, in a sense, like Genesis 6, taking a daughter of man to make her his own. They have repeated that mistake over again. And Abram invited that by going down there. And if you think about the story arc of what will happen with Israel as they leave Egypt, God has now brought Abram's descendants out of Egypt. He's bringing them to the new Eden space that he has promised Abraham, the Canaan land that he is going to deliver them to. And when they cross through the Red Sea, they see the armies of Pharaoh drowned, washed up on the seashore. A very prolific image of, you will never have to deal with these people again. You are not to go back to Egypt. Do not make treaties with them. Do not go down there and even establish trade with them. That's the idea. But before they even get the chance to enter the land, when Moses, in the midpoint of the book of Numbers, brings them right here to the southern border and sends a representative from every tribe into the land to spy it out for 40 days, when they come back with their report, what happens? Basically, the entire nation just rejects the idea of the Exodus altogether. We don't want your Eden space. We don't want your paradise. We don't want your kingdom commission, and we don't want your priestly mandate upon us to do what you've called us to do for the nations. We would rather go back to the ease of slavery in Egypt, where our lives are told to us day in and day out what we will do, what we will eat, and how we will die. But that's exactly what Abram was reaching for in Genesis 12. And that's what his own people will wind up doing later on, centuries later. That connection's huge, because if we're seeing it happen in the progenitor of the nation, it's expected to see it happen again later on in the people. All right, so just to work with this a bit more, Abram sees there's trouble in the land, a challenge to the promise of God's provision. He heads to Egypt, and with that, Abraham expresses fear that God will not protect him if his life is endangered by foreign kings. Same thing happens in Numbers 12. That's the reason why they decide we don't want to go into the land, right? Because those kings and those city-state nations are more powerful than we are. We are like grasshoppers in their sight. But to get away from the Exodus arc for a second and just focus a little bit more back on the Genesis material, I want to look a little bit at Genesis 15 with Abram questioning the idea of whether or not God is even going to give him the land or provide him seed. That's what Abraham's really working with in that moment. There's been a little time, we don't know how much exactly, that's passed between the time that Abram has left Egypt and come back into the land, and he's lived there, but yet Sarai has still not conceived a child, born him anyone, and as far as he can tell, he could die at any day, even though I'm guessing he's probably the picture of health. And the only person he has to give his estate to is this servant that he's picked up along the way in his travels from Ur through Haran and Egypt and so forth. That is now probably the most trustworthy person he would dare give all of his possessions to. But notice that when God shows up on the scene, God does not answer with, Abram, I can understand. Let me console you. I promise you by showing you this, that, or the other to guarantee the fact that I'm going to give you children. He has already spoken toward the idea of multiplying his descendants like the stars in the heavens. But instead, he answers with a demand for sacrifice. And then when Abram actually winds up sacrificing these animals, something really trippy winds up happening. So let's actually read some of the verses from Genesis 15, verses 9 through 18, and we'll talk about it a little more. So God said to him, bring me a 3-year-old cow, a 3-year-old female goat, a 3-year-old ram, a turtle dove, and a young pigeon. Very specific. So he brought all these to him, and then we don't exactly know how Abram understood that he's supposed to do this, but nonetheless, he takes it upon himself to cut them in half, and he laid the pieces opposite each other. So if you're thinking about it rightly, then you would have a piece of a carcass here, a piece of a carcass here, and then another, at least as goes the 4-footed mammalian beasts go. The birds were not cut in half. They were just slain and supposedly laid on each side of what becomes now a kind of pseudo walkway. And if you're really stopping to put yourself there, it's important, at least once, to try to reach out and grasp the imagery as best you can, even though some of us kind of have our stomachs turned at thinking through these things. But can you imagine the amount of physical effort that even for younger people, if you're working in a team of 5, to try to saw an entire cow in half? Can you imagine what that... I don't even know what tools he used. I mean, not to mention the process of actually opening up the carcass. Imagining he slit the throat first and then all the blood drained out, and after the animal had completely exsanguinated, Now he's got the arduous task of trying to cut it apart. That once you cut into the belly cavern, that all the entrails come spilling out. And of course, if you've ever field dressed a deer or anything like that, you know it is not a sanitary process by no means, and it's messy. I mean, before you know it, you're up to your elbows in blood and guts, and that stuff is sticky and it does not smell nice. And then, after he finally arranges all that stuff, he's out there long enough for the flies to start to descend and stick to the blood that spattered their hides. And the vultures must be circling above, and buzzards and whatnot, just ready for either Abram to join them as he dies from dehydration and being out there all day long or whatever, because God has taken his sweet time. He's not yet showed himself. But there's gore, there is blood, there is carnage all over the place. I mean, for as big an area as you can imagine, this whole entire area must be just as deep crimson red as you can imagine. And again, flies on the piles of guts and fat that's all over the place. Anyway, so verse 11, birds of prey came down on the carcasses, but Abram drove them away. As the sun was setting, a deep sleep came over Abram, and suddenly great terror and darkness descended upon him. There's a reason why Moses wants us to capture that detail of terror and darkness. Where in the little bit of narrative space from Genesis 1 up to now, the beginning of 15, have we seen the use of these images of darkness and chaos, if we want to substitute a word out for terror? Where have we seen that at work or play? Creation, Genesis 1, primordial waters. There's darkness, there's nothing else but the water, God's Spirit moving. So God manifests himself, brings order from the chaos, correct? And so if we're thinking with that detail in mind, then the next thing that should pop in our mind as we've appreciated those hyperlinks is, if something attached to creation imagery is coming on the heels of these two particular things that Moses just dropped for us, what does it mean? See how God answers this quandary of Abram with what happens here. Then the Lord said to Abram, know this for certain, your offspring will be resident aliens for 400 years in a land that does not belong to them and will be enslaved and oppressed. However, I will judge the nation they serve, and afterward they will go out with many possessions. And we just saw that happen in Genesis 12, correct? With Abram going to a place that wasn't his, coming out of there after God brought judgment with many more possessions than they possessed, going down into that place. Verse 15, but you will go to your ancestors in peace and be buried at a great old age. In the fourth generation they will return here, for the iniquity of the Amorites has not yet reached its full measure. And when the sun had set and it was dark, a smoking fire pot and a flaming torch appeared and passed between the divided animals. On that day the Lord made a covenant with Abram, saying, I give this land to your offspring from the brook of Egypt to the great river, the river Euphrates. So get that. This is God's answer to the quandary. I'm predicting that your people are going to go into exile. Well, God, the question was, how will I know that I'll possess this land? I don't own any of it. I have literally not paid a single piece of money or exchanged anything from what is part of the great stock of wealth you've blessed me with to any of the people who actually claim inheritance rights to this land here in Canaan. So because if I was to drop dead at this moment, I have nothing to pass on to anybody I name my successor, except for the things that will follow me or that I pack up and carry with me on my beasts of burden everywhere I go. And this is God's answer. So your people won't stay here. They'll go somewhere else. And they'll go there up to 4 generations later. But then I will judge that nation who has oppressed them. So not only will they go someplace and be temporary residents, it's going to really be bad for them for a while. He doesn't go into any real detail, but to be oppressed as slaves, in Abram's mind, in that day and time, that's never a good thing. Your life is not your own. So as opposed to God giving further blessing upon Abram, it's about as dark and gloomy as you can get. Your people will be pushed out of this land, go someplace else for potentially centuries to come back here. But when I bring them here, I will make them wealthy. Exorbitantly wealthy. And I will give this land to you through them. And then God manifests himself again through a smoking firebrand and a flaming pot that passes down in between this row of carcasses that Abram has situated here. So what does God do basically to answer Abram's quandary? He gives him a picture of the Exodus. The blood and gore that's going to happen through the conflagration of 10 terrible plagues, death throughout the land of Egypt at multiple points, and most profoundly in the 10th and final plague with the taking of the firstborn, and then the drowning of Pharaoh's army in the Red Sea, the washing of their bodies up on the shore. That is about as carnage-ridden as you can get. And from the moment they leave Egypt's borders, God is leading them in a pillar of cloud, very similar to smoke, and fire, smoking fire pot or firebrand, by day and night, leading them kind of the way that you see a path cut between the swaths of these animals, the death and carnage all around, to go away from that, as God will lead them away from the pit of carnage, the land of death that is Egypt, to the land of promise, which is how this little quandary ends as God is answering him, I will give this land to your people. God answers Abraham's question through a picture of the Exodus. Hugely important. So now we're back on another high note. Genesis 13, Abram really kind of stunk it up for a minute by almost giving the land away. Sorry, my computer's delaying just a second. By almost giving the land away to his nephew Lot, but God redeems that. And then, of course, we have this picture here in Genesis 14, which we're about to talk about here in a second, of the battle of the kings and blessing of Melchizedek and so forth. But moving on beyond that into 15, now we have Abram wrestling with his faith and God answers. Then we move into Genesis 16 through 17, which is a bit of a drop-off again. And you've already seen this slide before, but I just wanted to salvage what you see in green and blue as being a sequence we've already seen in Genesis 3 and 4, and seeing here how these things parallel with what's going on here in Genesis 16 and 17. Because in Genesis 3, the woman saw the tree, that it was desirable for obtaining wisdom. We don't have the use of the word see, but you have to know, obviously, as Abram would find Hagar attractive. She's much younger than Sarai is. She's Egyptian. You know, their grooming standards were world-renowned at the time. I could go on as to all the reasons why Abram might have found this very titillating offer something that he would easily jump at if his wife was giving him a hall pass and telling him, you can do it. You can make her a wife. And not just for a night so that she becomes pregnant, but then she's back to slave girl status. In this ancient time, it would be understood that if she took on this role, she would have rights as a wife. Might be somewhat inferior to the primary wife, but a wife nonetheless, which is kind of part of the derogatory expression of Abram in saying to Sarai, when Sarai, after Hagar conceives, is all in a tiz because now Hagar is acting haughty, and she doesn't like that. And she wants to put her back in her place, but she doesn't presume to do that without first going to Abram. Why? Because she's Abram's wife. But then Abraham snubs her and says, she's still your servant. Do what you want with her. But that aside, Abram sees Hagar, and instead of speaking prophetically, go back to the garden. Who is it beside the woman here who is watching the events unfold between her and the shining one who is telling her, you'll be like God, and you won't die if you eat that fruit? Instead of stepping up and speaking prophetically, bearing the image of God and saying, that's not what God has said, and we will go inquire of him as to the new truth claim that you're offering us. Instead, it's a, really? Okay. Sounds like a bit of a sweeter deal to me. That's exactly what Abram's doing here. Instead of solidifying the covenant promise that God has made and bolstering Sarai's faith, instead, he decides to jump at the deal for what it is. But we do actually have a follow-on parallel here with, then she took the fruit, much in the same way that Abram decides to take Hagar as Sarah offers him over to him, and then he winds up sleeping with her, conceiving a child that wasn't actually supposed to be a part of this sequence. And God, in his redemptive manner, doesn't choose to punish Ishmael. In fact, when Hagar is running away off into the wilderness to presumably just die, I mean, with where they're encamped, they're surrounded by desert primarily on almost all sides. And that's exactly where the angel of the Lord winds up finding her. She's moving back southward, potentially, I guess, to run back to Egypt maybe. There's no possible way she'll make it there. She left hastily, does not have provisions. A woman traveling out in the open like that would be a sweet little morsel of meat for a lion to pounce upon, considering all the bandits that littered the roads that would be known for travel routes between either Canaan or Midian and the provinces of Arabia, moving on into Egypt. A woman would be easy prey. There's no way she was going to survive this journey. And yet, she does. She runs out there anyway. And point being is that God finds her out there and not only tells her she's going to conceive a son, but God is going to make a great nation out of this child. And he's not obligated to do that, but yet he does that anyway. He doesn't punish Ishmael, but then instead, God brings this in chapter 17 back on Abram's head, as we were talking about a second ago. Now, at the center point of this chiasm we were talking about, God reaffirms this covenant by now taking it a step further, changing Abram's name to Abraham, father of many nations, and he says this is how this covenant's going to be transferred from you to all the descendants after you, every male in your household, even the ones that are not natively born to you, everybody, whether you own them or you gave birth to them, have to be circumcised, which becomes hugely important for many reasons, and we're going to build on that as we move on through this. But nonetheless, the point being is that this, as I said earlier, a sign of judgment, because the inversion of this is if you are not circumcised, then you are cut off from the people. So this is God's way of expressing judgment on the terrible action of what just happened. Now, you might still hold that with some degree of skepticism. Like, I'm not so sure that I see that there. If you've understood something of the narrative flow of what we've been watching here as this is going on, Genesis 12 starts out on a high note, and then it ends on something of a bad note, with them being in Egypt. Then, as we work through 13 and God kind of helping Abraham understand a little better, we go through 14, which we're going to touch on here in just a second. 14 ends on a high note. It carries us on over into 15, all the way into 16, and now down into 17, where we've got some more boneheaded mistakes by Abram. If we're following the cycle, then we should understand and appreciate all the more that the giving of this sign of the covenant of circumcision is perhaps a double-sided coin, something to be seen as a blessing because that means we are part of Abram's people. But this potentially might not have been a part of that covenant had Abram not made the mistake he did in Genesis 16. And what do you see happening but the same thing with Abram's descendants that come after him later on? We'll have a chance to reiterate this when we get there. Now, I would be remiss if I didn't take the opportunity to try to talk about what seems like something of a bit of an enigmatic story here in Genesis 14 with Melchizedek. I'm just going to read some verses if you want to join me. There we are in 14, verses 17 through 24. After Abram returned from defeating Chedorlaomer and the kings who were with him, this is the four-king coalition that came from the east, so around the plain of Shinar, to come and fight against the five kings around the area of Canaan and the cities of the plains, which is what we would call the Dead Sea and the area around it. It's all desert now, but presumably back then it would not have been. And the kings who were with him, the king of Sodom went out to meet him in the Shaveh Valley, that's the king's valley, and Melchizedek, king of Salem, or Shalem, as it's said or pronounced in Hebrew, brought out bread and wine. He was a priest to God Most High. He blessed him, parenthetically, that's Abram, and he said, Abram is blessed by God Most High, creator of heaven and earth, and blessed be God Most High, who has handed over your enemies to you. And Abram gave him a tenth of everything. Then the king of Sodom said to Abram, give me the people, but take the possessions for yourselves. But Abram said to the king of Sodom, I've raised my hand in an oath to the Lord, God Most High. This should firmly solidify in our minds that Melchizedek, who is a king and priest to God Most High, is not referencing a God foreign to Abram, but is in every way the very God who Abram worships. All manner of theories as to who that could be. That's not the point of our discussion on this, but nonetheless, creator of heaven and earth, that I will not take a thread or sandal strap or anything that belongs to you, so that you can never say, I made Abram rich. I will take nothing except what the servants have eaten. But as for the share of the men who came with me, Aner, Eshcol, and Mamre, they can take their share. So what is this whole thing about? It's weird, right? I mean, here, Abram comes back down toward the vicinity of where he was kind of camped at. It wasn't at Jerusalem, but it's close enough that Melchizedek, who is not some sort of phantomous apparition, he is, I would argue that he probably not a pre-Bethlehem appearance of Jesus, in the idea that he was not a real person, just manifests himself for this one piece of story sequence, and then moves on as if to say there was not somebody who was currently ruling over Jerusalem at this time. He's a type, and there are many people who typify Jesus' role, but to say that Jesus has pre-Bethlehem appearances, or what we might call theophanies, would be better understood in a figure like the angel of the Lord, who can show up in a moment, completely unanticipated, and then leave in just as much as he was unanticipated to arrive, leave in the same unanticipated manner, and affect whatever cause or change he wanted to in that temporal moment. And a part of the drama of him showing and leaving as he does is what further drives home the point that, as Jacob would say, I've wrestled with God, or as others might say, we've just met God face to face and terrified for their very lives. That's nothing what you see surrounding Melchizedek. So I would argue against the idea this is a pre-Bethlehemic Christophany or appearance of Jesus. And like any other ancient king of the time, he no doubt has an entourage, a massive amount of people, his whole court and whatnot, who have come out to meet all of these other foreign dignitaries and heads of state, as these other 5 kings on the west side of this coalition are out there too. Obviously, the king of Sodom is part of this, correct? So understanding that, he typifies Jesus, but not a pre-Bethlehem appearance of him. But why in the world does he bless Abram? And beyond that, where did he get knowledge of the Most High God? I mean, it seems like from the moment we've moved on from Babel in Genesis 11 up until this point, though there's only a few chapters that's transpired, it gives us the idea that only Abram is really the only person out there who knows anything about the one true God. Who is this guy, and how did he maintain knowledge in this post-flood world of the one true God? Job would be another example. But while we'll never get an answer to such a thing, and there are very intriguing theories, what we can see here as part of the motivation of Moses, and including this, is kind of the same reason why when we get off over here in chapters 37 through 50, and we've got the Joseph story, I'm just going to spoil it for you now. Part of my intent in what we'll talk about there is we yet again have another microcosmic scenario of what God's great big meta-narrative picture is. That God has called Abram, and he wants to take and repackage, repurpose, and put out there for the world's benefit the very Eden agenda and ideal that he gave to Adam, put onto Noah, and now Abram is becoming something of what you see going on in the Joseph story with the people of Israel in Egypt. God is kind of giving them a time to scrimmage that out, to see the ideal understanding of what does it mean for God's kingdom, what does it look like and how does it function before he draws them out of Egypt and then puts them into the land of Canaan and then says, okay, you saw how it was supposed to work, now let's make this happen. Real time, okay? We'll talk about that when we get there. I think we see something of the same thing going on here with the use of this person in this story, in this Melchizedek figure. Because notice this. If you stop and think about it, there are at least 2 people in the Genesis and Exodus sequence who are named as high priests, Jethro being the father-in-law of Moses. And while it seems like he probably starts out as something of a polytheistic high priest, once the people of Israel have left Egypt and they come to camp at Sinai and Jethro comes to pay them a visit, he comes to do the very same thing that Melchizedek does. Melchizedek blesses the very God whom he serves and worships, and that Abram worships and serves. Jethro, after hearing the story of what God did through Moses in bringing the people out of Egypt and has now brought them to Sinai, which was the very sign that God said by which Moses would know that I have been with you this whole time, is that you will come and worship me here. What does Jethro do? But he blesses God Most High and his people. Neither of these people are from the stock of Abram. Neither of them are Israelites. And because of their non-Hebrew origin, it's very weird, if we're thinking about it, to see the amount of attention that is being shown them in the narrative space that Moses gives them, considering their Gentile origin, and yet the only other people we have mentioned to us as priests in the rest of Torah are Hebrews. And the very first person to wear that title, high priest, is his own brother. But the priestly actions of Melchizedek and Jethro are only given to us in glowing light. The very first priestly actions that we have of Aaron is in Exodus 32, and guess what he's doing? Making a golden calf. and inviting everybody to come to a big festival tomorrow to get drunk and carouse and do whatever else, and bowing down to this God who brought them out of Egypt. And for the rest of the Torah space and beyond, the Levites are not painted in a very good light in most cases. And there's a reason for that. And it's not because Moses hates his brother or that he's trying to be purposefully derogatory toward him. It's just to help us understand the ideal of the Edenic priesthood that began with Adam is seen more clearly in these non-Hebrew people to help us better understand that even from the beginning of the Scripture's story and this great diorama of exile in Genesis 11 with the expulsion at Babel to redemption, which is what the whole entire rest of the biblical story through the New Testament is about, is an open invitation for all peoples to become part of God's covenant family and to resume that mantle of being priests. All right? Because that's what's going on here. Remember back in Genesis 12 that God said, I will bless those who bless you, curse those who curse you. What exactly is Melchizedek doing here? Blessed be Abram. He is bringing blessing to Abram. And by virtue of that, Melchizedek gets accorded a very high honor in Scripture. In the 110th Psalm, what do we have here? But the Lord said unto my Lord, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies your footstool. The very messianic figure that David speaks of as being greater than himself, and we understand from the New Testament writings, even preeminent to himself, is being typified after not the priesthood of Aaron, but the priesthood of Melchizedek, without beginning and having no end. Correct? And then, of course, we see this ideal kind of being put forth out there in some of the stories like David. You think about David's procession when he comes into Jerusalem after he's conquered the city and made it his capital, and he's dedicated a space. Well, he wants to dedicate a space for building the temple, but he dedicates a purpose for wanting to build the temple, and he wants to bring the Ark of the Covenant into the city. He does so through a very triumphant procession. The Levites are carrying it every 6 paces. They're slaughtering an animal. He is singing and dancing out there. He's wearing a priestly garment by putting an ephod on his body. And of course, after this whole thing is over and done with, he leads a celebration further by giving all the people food. He rations out supplies for everyone, from the nobles down to the peasants. Everybody gets to share as equals that day. And he, in that moment, re-images the concept of what was lost in Genesis 1 and 2 with the first human beings that were the coronated and commissioned king and queen priest. And we see other examples of how God kind of frowns on such a thing when something like that is taken through pride, like Uzziah. But we get this beautiful picture of what's going on in Zechariah 6. Zechariah 6, here we are post-exile, after they've been brought back from Babylon, and they're rebuilding Jerusalem and repurposing and reforging from the remnants of what was the old temple and building a new one. And then we have this moment where Joshua, the high priest, is brought forth before Zechariah and several of the other nobles, especially Zerubbabel, their governor, but the direct descendant of David through the line of Judah, who should be wearing the crown as king. And instead, God tells them to take gold and silver, make a crown, put it on the head of Joshua, the high priest, and then speak about the one whose name is the branch, a messianic title being given to the high priest. And we are told about how there will be a union between the two, and he will rule with peace on his throne. And it is this one who will go out and build the house of the Lord. A reunification of the office of king and priest. And we understand this has huge messianic implications, because when you go to Isaiah 25, when the day of the Lord comes, on that day, on the very cosmic mountain of God, the Lord of armies will prepare for all peoples a feast of choice meat, aged wine, prime cups of choice meat, and fine vintage wine. What did Melchizedek bring out here while he's blessing Abram? From the text, it says he specifically brought. Now, granted, we've got a few more accoutrements in this feast here that Messiah will be hosting on the cosmic mountain of the Lord, with choice cuts of meat and so forth. But fine vintage wine, and you know bread's got to be a part of it, because the imagery here would not be what you and I would accord as a feast, but what they would understand in their day and time, and there is no such thing as a meal without bread and wine. And do you think that it's in any way coincidental that of all the things that was on the table spread out in front of Jesus' disciples, the last Passover Seder that he has with them, of all the things that he could have taken and used as illustrations of what he's about to endure and what will be the everlasting icons of the fellowship that we share with him when we come to the table of the King and share in this meal together as family, that the very things he picks up are bread and wine, to become the symbols of the new covenant. Considering how he is the one who fulfills the whole entire Psalm 110 format, it's obviously not supposed to escape our attention. But the point I make with this slide is simply this. God has not lost the concept of a superior priesthood, and it's what he wants us to continue to work with in the back of our minds as we take this story and we see God working with it, as we continue to see the image in the standard and ideal of a priesthood that transcends the concepts of what the Levitical priesthood is supposed to be doing, not just simply offering sacrifices, but blessing all of humanity and bringing the abundance of Eden with us everywhere we go if we are followers of Jesus. All right, our last slide. So, pictures of Passover. Something we need to understand. I know that we don't really get Passover mentioned for us by name until Exodus 12, which carries us all the way up through 13 with the first observance of this feast slash sacrifice. But as I've tried to help tease out elements of various things such as Exodus cycles and stories that we've already looked at, I want to do the same thing with respect to Passover, because we've already seen the elements of the Passover feast laid down for us throughout the story of Abram, which carries us prolifically all the way up to Genesis 22. So before I talk about that, let's actually read some verses from Genesis 22. So Genesis 22, beginning in verse 1. After these things, God tested Abraham and said to him, Abraham, here I am, he answered. Take your son, he said, your only son Isaac, whom you love, go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains I will tell you about. So Abraham got up early in the morning, saddled his donkey, took with him 2 of his young men and his son Isaac. He split wood for a burnt offering, set out to go to the place that God had told him about, and on the 3rd day, Abraham looked up, saw the place in the distance. Then Abraham said to his young men, stay here with the donkey. The boy and I will go over there to worship. Then we'll come back to you. Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering, laid it on his son Isaac. In his hand he took the fire and the knife, and the 2 of them walked on together. Then Isaac spoke to his father Abraham and said, my father. And he replied, here I am, my son. Isaac said, the fire and the wood are here, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering? Abraham answered, God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son. Then the 2 of them walked on together. When they arrived at the place that God had told him about, Abraham built the altar there and arranged the wood. He bound his son Isaac and placed him on the altar on the top of the wood. Then Abraham reached out, took the knife to slaughter his son. And then, as the story goes on, beginning in verse 12, then he said, the angel that stopped him, do not lay a hand on the boy or do anything to him. I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your only son from me. Abraham looked up at him and saw a ram caught in the thicket by its horns. So Abraham went, took the ram, offered it as a burnt offering in place of his son. And Abraham named that place, the Lord will provide. So today it is even still said, it will be provided on the Lord's mountain. Get this. We go back to Genesis 15. God answers Abram's query with the idea of a picture of the exile and pending exodus that's going to come in the future of his people. But you appreciate the elements. A sacrifice of an animal, an emphasis on the firstborn. Isaac's not mentioned by name, but where are these descendants going to come from? Obviously, it's going to have to come through the child that is promised to be birthed through Sarah, correct? A prediction of exile, a picture of Exodus, and a promise of New Eden, because when he come back to the land that's promised, that's again the idea, reaching back to Genesis 12, of what God has already purposed to happen. We move forward in the narrative when we go to chapter 17 through 19. Now, this is a little strange, of course, because here with this, we've got a couple of different things. We've got the whole entire sequence of God coming down to visit Abram. And when he does so, or Abraham at this point, when he does so, it's with the intent of telling Abraham about what he's about to do to Sodom. But notice when Abraham sees these 3 visitors coming to him as he's sitting under the shade of the trees, he quickly goes and tells his wife, go start preparing cakes of bread. There's no time for the yeast to do its action of making the dough rise. This has to be unleavened bread. And then, of course, he goes out and he kills a calf that's tender enough for them to eat and appreciate. And, of course, because it's not a massive, huge animal, it will be a lot quicker to roast. It's not a lamb or a goat, which is what we have in the Exodus 14 sequence, but it's still the shedding of the blood of an animal for the sake of a meal. A lot of times when we think of Passover, the only images that we ever call to mind is the idea of lamb. We forget it could be a goat. Blood. We even forget the stuff that they're used to spatter it on the doors with. But putting blood on the side post and the lintel, and that's it. That's all we ever talk about with respect to Passover. We forget the priestly elements of the use of hyssop, which is repurposed so many other times in priestly functions. We forget the idea that after they do that, they all bring themselves inside after they've roasted said animal, and they have to eat the thing. And they eat it with unleavened bread. And the only people who get the chance to share in this are circumcised males. In fact, it's in this moment, before they've even eaten the meal and left Egypt, that the edict is given. It's going to be a perpetual feast, honored in memorial for what has happened here tonight, year in and year out. So everybody gets a chance to experience the Exodus all over again. And if you're not part of Abraham's stock because you're not circumcised, you don't get the chance to experience this. Period. End of story. So that's part of the first portion of this sequence. And then when the two angels that accompany God leave to go to Sodom to bring Lot out of this place, what happens with Lot? He sees these men out in the city square. He brings them in the house. And when they do, the first thing that we think of as soon as he's closing that door is that the men who want to gang rape them are right there behind him, just banging on the door, demanding that he let out the guests that are staying in his house. There was enough time, though, for him to prepare a meal. Not enough time for kneaded dough with yeast in it to be made, but nonetheless, it's even said in the text, unleavened bread was used. And of course, an animal was slaughtered for the sake of satiating the guests that are there, showing them the hospitality that he was required to. Why are these elements of Passover being given to us in these story sequences? Because what does Passover precede? In fact, the very night when the people in Egypt experienced the first Passover meal, as the sun is about to set, the death angel or destroyer will come. With the dawning of the next morning, they now begin the first day of what? Exodus. Passover precedes Exodus. What's Lot getting ready to do? He's about to leave Sodom because that place is about to be destroyed with fire and brimstone. Then we get to the story of what we just read here, same thing. Actually, I do want to point out something I was about to forget. We go back also here to the idea of what's going on in Sodom and Gomorrah, and the reason why God is saying to Abram he is about to destroy this place is because of the cries that have come up of the measures of injustice and oppression and so forth of what's being exacted upon the people who live in Sodom and Gomorrah and the travelers who come there seeking a place to stay and yet are treated so inhospitably or even oppressed by being gang raped or whatever else, mauled by the inhabitants of the city rather than sheltered and given measures of hospitality and so forth. And so because of that, God is judging. What exactly is God saying to Moses at the burning bush in Exodus 3? The reason why he has come now to deliver his people. I have heard not their shouts of joy and laughter because they're so enthralled at being slaves, right? Anyway, back to Genesis 2, or 22. Genesis 22, we don't have all the elements there, but we do have the sacrifice of an animal. Even though Ishmael has been born, and he's technically Abram's firstborn, what is it that God says to Abraham? Bring your son, your only son, Isaac, as if to say, the one who really matters, the son of promise, the one who technically lives in God's sight because God has granted him miraculous life, is Isaac. And of course, a beautiful picture of the Exodus. You're like, where's the Exodus in this? Well, we've got a platform, an altar made of stones, upon which an animal is going to be placed there, and the animal is not supposed to get off of it because the animal is going to die. But instead, it was his son that was placed there with the intent of him dying. But his son is cut loose, let go, and an animal is substituted in his place. And so his son, as the writer of Hebrews is picking up on in chapter 11, is riffing off the idea that his son, even though he technically didn't die, rose from that picture of death. And resurrection is nothing short of Exodus. It's exactly what that's supposed to be seen as. And when we get up into Exodus 3 and 12, we can see the same thing. It shouldn't be a surprise to us that those elements are there. And of course, much more can be said about Genesis 22 and the obvious parallels with respect to Jesus. We can even get really nerdy with it and talk about some of the details of how the wood was placed upon Isaac. And of course, Jesus had to bear a wooden crossbeam as he made his way from Jerusalem up to the place where he was hung. And all of those are very valuable points to make. But the point is not to see Jesus so microscopically that we miss the forest for the trees. This, too, is a picture of Exodus. Because if you think about it, as we wind this down to its close, the story arc of Abram, who became Abraham over a period of 10 chapters, has been a calling out of the exile of the nations that leads up to the end of his story arc with the Passover deliverance of his son. His son allowed to rise up off that table of death. And by virtue of that, the promise and legacy of Abraham will live on through the promised son, who eventually, through his own descendants, will wind up being the answer to the problem of how will all the rest of the nations locked away in exile wind up being able to make their way past the cherubim that keeps them outside the garden back into the Eden temple presence of God. That's what this whole story is about. And again, it's nothing but a microcosmic bubble of what God's about to do on a much larger scale with the people that will come from Abraham. But before we get there, we're going to work through Isaac and then Joseph. Well, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph. And then we'll jump into that story and talk about it more. Hopefully I will not have stolen too much thunder by the time we get there. So anyway, any concluding comments or questions, hiccup points that I may have tripped you up on? I certainly don't want anybody to leave with lingering questions that you might forget between now and next week.
Interesting. I went to Israel 2 years ago. Odyssey did on a trip. Yeah. And when you're talking about Lot and Abram separating, when we were standing there looking down at the Jordan River Valley, where that was, they say, kind of took place, our thoughts, we even talked about it, were why was there, why did they not go together? It's huge. It's enormous as far as you can see.
Wow.
I mean, there's no way that there would not have been. It's lush and just and beautiful, and we were thinking, why did they separate? You know, but
yeah,
man's wisdom, not trusting God.
Right.
I mean, it is. It's absolutely. It gets down to they didn't trust God.
As I'm thinking about that, it's like Abraham's decision to bring Lot along with him created that situation, and Abraham's decision to go into Egypt also contributed to that problem because the wealth and prosperity came from Egypt. Lot came from his bringing him along in the first place, and so it's like in both instances, his own mistakes lead to him almost making the big mistake, if you will, of passing over the land and losing the promise and the covenant and all of those things.
Precisely.
Like he would have never had to have been in that position if he had just done what was right from the beginning.
Exactly. If he had taken those Eden moments for what they were and chose the right source of wisdom versus the wrong source. Absolutely.
Haven't ever heard that before about circumcision. Also being a sign of the covenant, but also being a sign of judgment. I've never heard it like that before, and I'm gonna have to look, dig a little deeper into that.
Absolutely.
But I see it. I see where that could be. They were, again, he was going against God, and God said, "No, I'm in control of that part of you as well."
Absolutely.
You trusted me.
Yeah, absolutely. Hopefully that becomes part of this process, is just throwing seeds out there, because again, with the amount of time that we have to talk about things, it's laying seeds down that hopefully blossom fruit later on in further discussion, but hopefully will also tickle those curiosity centers in people's brains that will want them to dig a little deeper to find resources that either refute or bolster one way or the other, because we're always learning. We're always learning.
And I think in parallel, like the idea of Exodus also and Passover both mean judgment as well. So for the Egyptians, there was judgment in the Passover and in the Exodus. And so I think we always want to say, "Come, Lord Jesus, come."
Right.
Not also, I think, realizing, but every heart that isn't turned to God will fall into judgment.
Precisely. Precisely. All right. Well, if nothing else, that will conclude our session.